Hello, friends. Welcome to a new episode of my podcast. My name is Bogdan, and I'm thrilled to have you with me today. Recently, I've been playing a video game, The Last of Us. If you are not familiar with this already classical game, or if you haven't seen the HBO show with the same title, it's actually a very good story set in a world transformed by a fungal pandemic. Civilization has collapsed, and what remains is a brutal struggle for survival. But the game is about people, their resilience, their fears, and the will to survive. It's also about their darkest impulses. The story follows a man named Jules and a young girl, Ellie, who might hold a key to the cure for this pandemic. But what's interesting about this story is this. While Jules and Ellie spend a lot of time fighting monsters, different zombies, infected, undead, these really horrific creatures, the most pain and suffering comes from humans. The tyranny, selfishness, cruelty, and violence people inflict on each other is far more devastating than any threat the monsters pose. The quarantine zones, for example, are meant to be a place of safety, a walled-off refuge where survivors are protected from the infected. But inside those walls, the authorities become tyranny. Soldiers and bureaucrats are ruling with an iron fist, rationing food, suppressing dissent, and using fear to maintain control. This made me think of the experiences of people in Ukraine during the Second World War. While it's universally and unequivocally recognized that the Nazis were monsters, most of the pain endured by Ukrainians came at the hands of the Soviets. Caught between two brutal regimes, Ukraine became a battleground of armies and ideologies, both of which viewed the region as expendable in their pursuit of power. Timothy Snyder, a historian at Yale University, has extensively discussed Ukraine's significance to Adolf Hitler's ambitions during the World War II. In his book, Bloodlands, Europe Between Hitler and Stalin, a brilliant book I highly recommend you, Snyder examines how Ukraine was central to Hitler's vision of expansion and resource acquisition. Hitler's vision for Eastern Europe was at the heart of Nazis' ideology, driven by the concept of Lebensraum, living space. He believed that the German people needed vast new territories to secure their future, and he identified Ukraine as the ideal area for colonization. Ukraine's fertile lands were seen as breadbasket that would feed the Aryan population, while its native inhabitants, primarily Slavs, would be, in his words, overcompeted. The Nazis also romanticized rural life and agricultural labor, idealizing it as the foundation of a pure and self-sufficient Aryan society. They envisioned transforming Eastern Europe into a vast agricultural hub, a sort of a massive Amish Nazi paradise. They glorified big families with many children working hard on a farm. While the Nazis embraced modern technology for war industries, their ideal society was paradoxically rooted in a vision of pre-industrial simplicity. The Nazis recognized the family farms as the cornerstone of a strong, self-sufficient society, but the Soviets took a radically different approach. The Soviets viewed the traditional peasantry as a class to eliminate. To them, small-scale farmers symbolized backwardness, and the future of agriculture lay in collective farms, where land, labor, and resources could be centrally controlled and distributed efficiently. This transformation was seen as essential to build communism, even if it meant dismantling traditions and destroying societies. The end justifies the means, as they liked to repeat. In Ukraine, the imposition of this Marxist vision led to the forced collectivization of agriculture. The Soviet regime seized land and resources from individual Ukrainian farmers, many of whom were arbitrarily labeled as kulaks, enemies of the state, regardless of their actual economic status. Resistance to collectivization was widespread, sparkling a wave of anti-Soviet uprising across Ukraine. Villagers burned crops, slaughtered their livestock, and sabotaged Soviet efforts to maintain control over their lives. Stalin responded to this in his usual manner. In 1932-1933, he orchestrated the Holodomor, a man-made famine designed to break the spirit of Ukrainian resistance, kill any hope for Ukrainian statehood, and punish the Ukrainian nation as a whole. By confiscating grain and other food supplies, while sealing off villages to prevent aid or escape, the Soviet regime starved millions of Ukrainians to death. The Holodomor was not merely a consequence of failed policies. It was a deliberate act of genocide aimed at erasing Ukraine's national identity and independence aspirations. Then World War II started. World War II came to Ukraine in 1939 in Carpathian Ruthenia, nowadays known as Zakarpattia Oblast of Ukraine. In 1939, this region was a part of Czechoslovakia and had enjoyed a degree of autonomy following the First World War. However, on March 15, 1939, Carpathians declared independence as the Republic of Carpato-Ukraine. Its sovereignty was short-lived. That same day, Hungary, a key Nazi ally, invaded, occupied, and annexed the region. At this time, at the beginning of World War II, the Nazis were only beginning to show the full scope of their brutality, having been responsible for around 10,000 deaths in Europe. In contrast, the Soviet Union had already unleashed mass terror on a staggering scale. Stalin's policies of collectivization, purges, and the engineered genocide of the Holodomor had claimed over 10 million lives. For Ukrainians, the looming war was not a confrontation between good and evil, but a clash of two brutal evils. And the Nazis had a strong case to seem like a lesser evil. The people of Ukraine faced an impossible dilemma during the World War II. Collaborating with either side, Nazis or the Soviets, meant risking your own life, as the other side would brand you as a traitor. Resisting both powers often meant facing annihilation. The choices Ukrainians had to make to survive were agonizingly complex. Do you turn in a partisan neighbor to save your entire village? Do you obey Nazis' orders? Do you risk everything to protect loved ones? Or do you stay silent in the face of unimaginable cruelty? Each decision carried unbearable consequences. Some Ukrainians served the occupiers and realized the unexpected fact that baffled many in the West. Those who collaborated with the Nazis were often the very same people who had earlier worked with the communists. This opportunistic behavior was driven not by ideology, but by a grim calculations of survival, or, for some people, career opportunities. It's a pattern echoed today in the West, as we see far-right and far-left politicians in Europe paradoxically aligning in their support for Putin, united by the shared disdain for liberal democracy and common love for Russia's dirty money. However, for some 95% of Ukrainians, there was no real choice. Millions were conscripted into the Red Army and sent to fight under horrific conditions, with no regards for their survival. My grandfather was among them. Stalin's military doctrine treated soldiers as expendable, relying on sheer numbers to overwhelm the enemy and to slow the Germans down on their way to Russia. Ukrainian recruits were thrown into battle without adequate training, equipment, or leadership. And it worked for Stalin. Actually, during the World War II, only 3% of Russia were ever occupied by the Nazis. Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltic states paid a heavy price to protect the metropole of the empire. Some 6.85 million of Ukrainians died in World War II, including 5.2 million civilians and 1.65 million military personnel. The end justifies the means. But a few brave Ukrainians refused to accept the grim reality and took matters into their own hands. They formed the UPA, the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, an underground movement committed to fighting for Ukraine's independence. As Soviet forces retreated from Ukraine in 1941, active Ukrainians seized the opportunity to proclaim the act of restoration of the Ukrainian state. This bold declaration aimed to establish a sovereign Ukraine free from both Soviet and Nazi domination. However, the Nazis, just like the Soviets, had no interest in an independent Ukraine. They swiftly suppressed this effort, arresting the leadership of the newly formed Ukrainian government, including Stepan Bandera, one of the most prominent figures in the independence movement. They and their families were sent to a concentration camp in Germany, where many of them died. Unlike his family, Stepan Bandera survived the Nazi concentration camp and settled in Munich as a war refugee. But the Russians sent a spy and killed him by spraying poison into his face. He survived the Nazis, killed by the Russians. Despite these setbacks, the UPA persevered. Against all odds, its members waged a desperate and multi-frontal resistance well into the 1950s, fighting not only the Nazis and the Soviets, but also at times the Poles, as Poland had their own claim on Ukrainian territories. This desperate struggle is a story of courage, ethnic cleansing, and tragedy that deserves its own moment of discussion, which I'll delve into another time. Returning to the Soviets, the Red Army is often romanticized for its role in the defeat of Nazi Germany. But what is frequently overlooked is the staggering human cost of that victory. In 1941, when Nazi forces launched the invasion, the Red Army was demoralized, largely because many soldiers had little desire to fight for Stalin and his brutal regime. The front collapsed, and Stalin resorted to terror as a means of control. In the early months of the war, Stalin issued a series of brutal decrees aimed at enforcing discipline and eliminating any signs of dissent within the military. One of the most infamous was the Order Number 227, the Not a Step Back order, issued in July 1942, which called for the immediate execution of any soldier who retreated without orders. Stalin implemented other severe decrees that targeted Soviet soldiers who were accused of cowardice, desertion, or retreating. As a result, according to the records, 994,300 soldiers were convicted by the Marshal Court, out of which 135,000 were executed. 422,700 were sent to penal battalions, which almost certainly meant death, and the rest, 436,000, were imprisoned. These numbers don't include the killed on the spot due to the Order Number 227. This execution rate far exceeds anything seen among the Western allies. In contrast, the United Kingdom executed approximately 40 soldiers, the United States 146, and France 102. The scale of Stalin's purges within his own military is mind-boggling. the 994,300 Soviet military personnel convicted by the Soviet Marshal Court is actually higher than the total number of soldiers from the UK, US, and France combined who died during World War II in both the European and Pacific theaters, including those killed in battle, missing in action, and other causes of death. Let it sink in. Nearly 1 million soldiers killed by their own government. This is the single most important number you need to know to understand the way the Red Army operated. The Soviet approach to Ukraine during the World War II was marked by a profound disregard for the civilian population too. When the Red Army retreated from the advancing Nazi forces in 1941, they took extreme measures to ensure that any resources that could be of use to the enemy were either destroyed or carried away. Soviet authorities evacuated industrial and agricultural equipment, stripping the country of its economic lifeblood. They also burned anything they couldn't take, including entire fields of ripe wheat, condemning the local population to starvation. This scorched earth policy left millions of civilians in a precarious situation. One of the most shocking acts of destruction during this retreat was the demolition of the largest dam in Ukraine, located in Zaporizhia. The Soviets destroyed the dam to prevent its use for electricity generation by the Germans. But this act also unleashed catastrophic consequences for the civilian population downstream. Tens of thousands of people were killed in the flood, a barbarian act mirrored by the Russian army in early hours of June 6, 2023. When Soviet forces reoccupied Ukraine in 1943-1944, anyone left behind during the German occupation was regarded as a collaborator, guilty by default. The whole nations were treated as traitors. The Crimean Tatars and Chechens were deported, and many Ukrainians were sent to the gulags indiscriminately. I had an opportunity to speak to one of those people who spent 8 years in the gulag. He told me that the reason they were kept there is because the Soviets needed slave labor, and people arrested during the first wave of Stalin's repressions in the mid-1930s had died or had been exhausted to an extent that they could not have worked anymore, so they needed to be replaced. Ukrainians in the Russian gulags built roads, railways, and mines for Russia. Now the Russians use this infrastructure to extract minerals and sell them to China. The chances are that nickel in your laptop or mobile phone was mined in mines built by Ukrainian slaves in the 1930s, 1940s. One of the most tragic consequences of the Soviet policies was the fate of young men in Ukraine, those who were too young to fight when the war began, but came of age during the German occupation. These men, often referred as black or grey suits, were rounded up by the Soviet forces and sent to fight or die on the front line, particularly during the Second Battle for Kiev in late 1943. They were called black or grey suits because they were not even given proper military uniform, and they fought in whatever cloth they were on when the Soviets took them away, often without any official registration of enlisting them to the military. According to some estimates, some 500,000 of young men like this died this way. The expulsion of the Nazis did not bring relief or liberation, but another phase of suffering under a new evil regime in Eastern Europe. My main message here is not to defend the Nazis, not in any way. Nazis were evil, but they were punished, and the Germans learned their lessons. My point is that unpunished evil will inevitably return. The Nazis had their Nuremberg tribunal, but the Soviets had none. Stalin's legacy is very much alive in Putin and in the Russian society as a whole. Just look at the destruction of the Kakhovka Dam, or how they've treated their own soldiers as expendable cannon fodder, disregarding human lives. In May, when we commemorate the victims of World War II and say never again, the Russians celebrate and say we can do it again. Just like in the game The Last of Us, the real monsters are not the obvious ones. The real monsters have been right here next to us. The US General Patton once famously said, "We may have been fighting the wrong enemy all along, but while we are here, we should go ahead after the bastards now, 'cause we are gonna have to fight them eventually." Was he right? Let me know what you think in the comments. Thank you for your attention and keep supporting Ukraine. It's really cheaper to help Ukraine now than fighting zombies later by yourself. Have a nice day.